For years, it barely existed on paper. No official designation on any published Iranian military order of battle, no acknowledgement in state media, nothing beyond a cluster of low structures and camouflaged storage bunkers tucked into a stretch of Iran's southern coastline that satellite analysts had quietly flagged years earlier as worth watching. Then, overnight, it was gone. Not damaged, not degraded. Effectively erased according to the commercial satellite imagery that surfaced within hours of the strike, showing a stretch of coastline that had, as recently as a week earlier, held a functioning military facility, now reduced to a field of craters and collapsed structures with almost nothing recognizable left standing. No warning strikes beforehand, no public buildup in the days before, no indication in open source tracking that a strike package of this scale was even inbound. One of the more secretive coastal installations in Iran's entire military infrastructure was simply gone by morning, and the people who study this kind of target for a living are still working through exactly how significant that actually is. I'm going to walk you through what this base appears to have been used for, how a facility this well hidden was found and struck with essentially zero public warning, and why the specific way this strike was executed might tell you more about American targeting capability in this conflict than almost any single strike we've covered on this channel. Stay with me, because there's a detail about what this base was actually storing that only became clear after analysts looked closely at what was left of it. Before I walk you through this sequence, I want to be upfront about how I'm approaching a story like this one, because a facility that was deliberately kept secret in the first place is inherently one of the hardest kinds of targets to analyze with real confidence after the fact, and it would be easy to fill the gaps in what we actually know with confident-sounding guesses. My background is in targeting analysis and irregular military infrastructure, specifically how covert or semi-covert facilities get identified, tracked, and eventually struck. That's the lens I'm using here. Where something is confirmed by satellite imagery or multiple independent analysts, I'll say so plainly. Where it's genuinely still uncertain, I'll tell you that too. Let's get into what we actually know. To understand why a facility like this one matters, you first have to understand why Iran builds installations that are deliberately kept off the books in the first place. Iran's publicly acknowledged military infrastructure, its major air bases, its known naval installations, its declared missile sites, exists under the assumption that adversaries already know roughly where it is and have planned around it accordingly. Alongside that declared infrastructure, Iran and its affiliated forces have spent years building a parallel network of smaller, deliberately obscured facilities specifically designed to avoid that same level of scrutiny, using camouflage, dispersed construction, and a total absence of official acknowledgement to keep these sites off. The target lists an adversary would build from publicly available information alone. These facilities typically serve purposes that Iran has strong reasons to keep quiet. Staging and storage points for equipment or weapon systems. Iran wants deniability over coastal infrastructure, supporting the kind of irregular naval activity we've discussed on this channel before, or logistics nodes supporting Iran's regional proxy network in ways that would be diplomatically awkward to acknowledge openly. This kind of dispersed, low-signature infrastructure strategy is a deliberate response to a lesson Iran has drawn repeatedly from watching how modern air power actually finds and destroys military targets. Large, fixed, publicly known installations are comparatively easy for an adversary with satellite coverage and persistent surveillance to monitor continuously, track for changes, and ultimately strike with confidence once a conflict begins. Iran's answer to that vulnerability has been to push a meaningful share of its more sensitive logistics and equipment storage capability into exactly this kind of small, dispersed, deliberately unremarkable-looking infrastructure, betting that sheer numbers and obscurity provide more durable protection than any single hardened, publicly known facility could offer on its own. That strategy has clear advantages, but it also depends entirely on maintaining genuine secrecy, and this strike is a direct test of whether that secrecy actually held. Coastal facilities specifically carry an additional layer of strategic value for exactly this kind of concealment. Because Iran's southern coastline offers both proximity to the Strait of Hormuz and the broader Gulf, and enough remote, sparsely populated terrain to make small-scale construction genuinely difficult to detect through casual observation alone. A facility built into this kind of terrain, kept small enough to avoid the obvious visual signatures of a major installation and never publicly acknowledged, can realistically operate for years without appearing on any open-source target list, precisely the outcome this specific base appears to have achieved before this strike. Here's what we know about how this facility was actually found. Satellite imagery analysts who specialize in tracking exactly this kind of irregular Iranian construction had reportedly flagged the general area as worth monitoring sometime before the strike occurred based on patterns of vehicle activity and construction consistent with the facility being actively used and expanded rather than simply abandoned infrastructure. That kind of preliminary flagging is common across dozens of similar sites throughout Iran that analysts track without necessarily concluding any of them are high-priority targets, and it does not. On its own, explain why this specific facility was struck when it was, with this level of precision, and without any of the public buildup or open-source tracking indicators that have preceded several of the more prominent strikes we've discussed on this channel. That absence of visible buildup is itself one of the most significant parts of this story. Previous major strikes in this conflict, including the ones involving long-range bomber missions we've broken down in earlier videos, have generally shown at least some detectable signature beforehand, unusual tanker activity, readiness, posture changes, or gaps in public tracking data that experienced analysts could identify as precursors even without knowing the specific target. This strike showed essentially none of that. Whatever aircraft or munitions were used appear to have been either based much closer to the target, using shorter range platforms that don't require the same kind of long-range logistical buildup a B-2 mission does, or executed with an even higher degree of operational security than previous missions in this conflict, avoiding detection by the same open-source tracking community that has become increasingly effective at identifying sensitive operations throughout this war. Several analysts have pointed to the geography and apparent damage pattern as consistent with a strike using shorter-range precision munitions launched from carrier-based aircraft or from Allied regional airfields, rather than the kind of long-range strategic mission that tends to leave more detectable indicators beforehand. Now let's talk about what the imagery actually shows and what it tells us about the strike itself. Commercial satellite passes over the site. In the days following the strike show a pattern of damage that analysts describe as unusually complete for a facility of this size. Multiple precise impact craters concentrated directly on what appear to have been the site's storage bunkers and primary structures, with comparatively little damage to the surrounding terrain outside the facility's immediate footprint. The precision matters because it suggests the strike package had detailed, accurate intelligence about the facility's exact layout beforehand, not just its general location. Since a less precisely targeted strike against a facility this size, and this camouflaged, would typically show a wider, less concentrated damage pattern as munitions searched for or missed specific structures within the site. This is the detail about what the base was storing that only became clear after analysts looked closely at what remained. Debris patterns visible in the days after the strike, combined with a specific configuration of what had been the facility's largest storage structures, led several analysts to conclude the site was very likely being used to store and stage naval mines and small fast attack boat equipment, the exact category of assets central to the kind of asymmetric naval harassment campaign Iran's coastal forces have relied on throughout this conflict. If that assessment holds up, it reframes this strike considerably. Rather than simply destroying an obscure secondary facility, this strike would have removed a meaningful chunk of the physical infrastructure, supporting Iran's ability to threaten shipping and naval assets specifically in the waters closest to the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most economically sensitive stretches of ocean in the entire conflict, and a type of target with a direct, practical connection to exactly the kind of incidents we've broken down in earlier videos on this channel. Iran's public response to the strike has been notably muted compared to its reaction to more prominent, publicly acknowledged facilities being hit earlier in this conflict. State media coverage has been limited, without the kind of detailed rebuttal or damage-minimizing statements Iran has typically offered after strikes against more significant, publicly known sites. That muted response is itself informative. A facility that was never officially acknowledged in the first place is awkward for Iran to comment on extensively without effectively confirming both its existence and its purpose, something the regime has clear reasons to avoid doing, regardless of how much actual damage was done. That incentive to stay quiet makes Iran's public silence here far less useful as an indicator of the strike's true significance than it might be for a more publicly declared target, which is part of why independent satellite analysis is likely to remain the primary source of real information about this incident going forward. Let's talk about what this strike tells us about American targeting capability more broadly, because that may be the most strategically significant part of this entire story. Successfully identifying, confirming, and precisely striking a facility that Iran spent real effort keeping off the radar entirely, without triggering any of the usual open-source warning signs beforehand, suggests a level of intelligence penetration into Iran's irregular, undeclared infrastructure that goes well beyond simply tracking known, publicly acknowledged sites. That capability, if it holds up across future strikes, means every similarly hidden facility Iran maintains, and there are very likely more than this single example, now has to be considered potentially compromised in exactly the same way, regardless of how carefully it was concealed or how successfully it has avoided detection up to this point. It's worth being specific about what kind of intelligence work a strike like this one actually requires, because it helps explain why analysts consider it so significant. Finding a facility. Iran deliberately built to avoid detection typically requires more than a single satellite pass, catching something unusual. It generally involves a sustained combination of persistent overhead surveillance tracking, subtle patterns over time, human intelligence sources with some awareness of the facility's existence or purpose, and increasingly, signals intelligence capable of picking up communications or equipment signatures associated with the site, even when its physical construction is deliberately unremarkable. A strike this precise, against a target this well hidden with essentially no detectable buildup beforehand, suggests multiple layers of that intelligence picture were already in place well before the decision to strike was made, which is a meaningfully different and more resource-intensive achievement than simply striking a large, already known facility with a known layout. That has real implications for how Iran's irregular forces operate for the remainder of this conflict. A network of hidden, deniable facilities only provides real strategic value if Iran can trust that adversaries genuinely don't know where they are. A single strike like this one, executed with this level of precision and this little public warning, undermines that trust considerably, forcing Iranian commanders to operate under the assumption that even their most carefully concealed infrastructure may already be identified and targetable. An assumption that tends to produce exactly the kind of costly, disruptive relocation and rebuilding effort we discussed in an earlier video covering a very different but strategically related target. The psychological dimension of that shift is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it may end up mattering as much as the physical loss of this one facility. Commanders responsible for Iran's dispersed network of hidden sites now have to make an uncomfortable choice: continue operating on the assumption that the rest of the network remains genuinely secret. A bet this strike has made considerably harder to justify, or begin the slow, expensive process of relocating and rebuilding a sensitive infrastructure on the assumption that concealment alone can no longer be trusted. Neither option is cheap, and the uncertainty itself, not knowing which facilities are still genuinely hidden and which may already be quietly identified and simply not yet struck, is likely to shape Iranian decision-making around this kind of infrastructure for a long time after this specific incident fades from the headlines. Let me bring this down to what actually matters here beyond the intelligence and targeting analysis. A facility built specifically to be invisible that appears to have functioned successfully as exactly that for years, being found and destroyed in a single overnight strike with essentially no public warning, is a genuinely unusual event even in a conflict that has already produced its share of dramatic strikes. It tells you something concrete about how much Iran's assumption of security through obscurity is actually worth right now. And the honest answer, based on what we can see in the aftermath, appears to be considerably less than Iranian planners were likely counting on when this facility was originally built. That single fact, more than the crater imagery or the specific asset assessment, may be the part of this story worth remembering longest. Wars are rarely decided purely by the biggest, most visible strikes. They are often shaped just as much by the accumulation of quieter moments like this one, where an adversary's core assumptions about what actually keeps them safe get tested and found wanting, one hidden facility at a time. Before you go, I want to ask you two things directly. First, if this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what actually happened here than the shorter clips and dramatic headlines circulating elsewhere, share it with one person trying to make sense of this conflict. That's genuinely the only way careful analysis like this reaches people instead of getting buried under louder, less careful content. Second, I want your read in the comments. Do you think this level of precision against a facility Iran worked hard to keep hidden means American intelligence has a far deeper picture of Iran's irregular infrastructure than most people assume? Or do you think this was a single lucky break rather than evidence of a broader pattern? Drop your assessment below. I read every one of them, and if this video delivered real value, a like helps it reach people who need a clear-headed breakdown instead of speculation. Here's where this stands. A previously unacknowledged Iranian coastal facility, likely used to store and stage naval mines and fast attack boat equipment supporting Iran's asymmetric naval operations near the Strait of Hormuz, was struck overnight and effectively destroyed, based on commercial satellite imagery, showing concentrated, precise damage to the site's main structures with minimal collateral impact to the surrounding area. The strike showed almost none of the open-source warning signs that have preceded other major missions in this conflict, suggesting either the use of shorter-range platforms based closer to the target or an unusually high degree of operational security. And the precision of the damage pattern indicates the strike package had detailed advanced intelligence about the facility's internal layout, not just its general location. Iran's muted public response, notably different from its reaction to strikes on more publicly acknowledged sites, is likely driven by the awkwardness of commenting on a facility the regime never officially admitted existed in the first place, rather than an indicator of the strike's true significance. What this incident most clearly demonstrates is that Iran's strategy of protecting sensitive infrastructure through concealment rather than declared hardening may be considerably less reliable than Iranian planners have assumed. A finding that likely applies to every other similarly hidden facility Iran maintains and is not yet publicly known to exist. Stay locked in on this one, because if this facility could be found and erased this cleanly, it raises a real question about how many more like it are still out there and how much longer they're likely to stay hidden.